On her birthday celebration, her billionaire CEO husband and kids handed her divorce papers and took the entire mansion, business, and all the wealth. My beautiful family, welcome back to Mr. Williams' storytelling. May the Almighty cover you with endless mercy, bless your homes with peace, and crown your hearts with strength that never fades. May He grant every woman dignity that cannot be shaken, every man wisdom that inspires, and every child joy that lights the world. May sorrow never hold you, and may your days shine brighter than the stars. I pray for your health, your success, and your family's happiness, that your steps lead only to blessings, and your nights bring you calm. The sound of rain against the tall glass windows should have been calming that evening, gentle, steady, almost soothing. But inside the Layton mansion, there was no peace. The candles on the dining table flickered unevenly, their light trembling like the woman who sat across from her husband and children. Arya Layton adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her late mother, one she wore every birthday. For 25 years, this day had always meant laughter, roses, and family dinners that stretched into midnight stories. She waited for that warmth, the same warmth that used to fill their home long ago. Across the table, Darian Layton's face was calm, unreadable. Their two grown children, Celine and Trevor, avoided their mother's eyes. The silence between them carried a weight Arya couldn't name, but her heart sensed it. Something was wrong. Still, she smiled, trying to hold on to tradition. "You're all being too serious for a birthday dinner," she said softly. "What's the surprise this time?" Darian didn't smile back. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white envelope. The movement was slow, deliberate. When he placed it in front of her, the table's candlelight caught the gold of his wedding band, a symbol that suddenly felt like a cruel joke. "Happy birthday, Arya," he said, in a voice that carried no affection, no trace of the man she had built an empire beside. Her smile faltered. "What's this?" "Open it." She hesitated, glancing at her children for some sign of reassurance. None came. Their eyes stayed fixed on the table, their hands folded neatly in their laps. Arya slid a finger under the seal and unfolded the crisp document. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was seeing. The words looked foreign, scattered, unreal. Then her breath caught. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Her pulse quickened. Beneath it lay another document. A transfer agreement. Layton Global, the mansion, the bank accounts, all reassigned. Every asset she and Darian had built together, now bearing his name alone. Her throat tightened. I don't understand." Darian's tone remained even, almost rehearsed. "It's all in there. The board voted for restructuring. I've ensured you'll have a trust fund, enough to live comfortably." A single word echoed in her mind, comfortably. After decades of sacrifice, that was all she was worth to him. Comfort. She turned toward her children, hoping this was some misunderstanding, some cruel mistake. "Celine, Trevor, tell me this isn't real." Neither spoke. Instead, Celine lowered her head and Trevor's jaw tightened. She noticed then. Their signatures were already on the papers, in neat blue ink beside the line marked witnesses. Her world tilted. The air around her grew heavier. "You both knew?" Her voice cracked, not from anger, but from disbelief. Trevor swallowed hard. "Dad said it was best, Mom. He said you'd understand." "Understand?" Arya could barely breathe. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt trapped behind years of silence, years spent holding her family together, while they quietly drifted away. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she pushed the papers away, her hands trembling. "You planned this, on my birthday." Darian leaned back, his gaze cold. "It's just business, Arya. You've had a good life. Now it's time for change." The clock on the far wall ticked once, twice, the sound sharp in the quiet room. In that moment, the woman who once managed multi-million-dollar deals and charity galas realized she was being dismissed from her own life like an employee being replaced. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, Arya Layton sat frozen, staring at the faces she loved most, faces that now looked like strangers. And that's when it hit her. Birthdays were meant to celebrate life. But this one had become the funeral of everything she had ever known. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you forgot to wonder if they could hurt you? That's how love often begins, with the belief that loyalty guarantees safety. Maybe you've felt it too. That quiet certainty that the people sitting at your table would never turn their backs on you. You serve them, sacrifice for them, and tell yourself that all the late nights, the forgiveness, the patience, it's all worth it, because they're family. That's what Arya believed. For years she gave everything, her youth, her time, her heart, believing it was all building something unbreakable. She thought love was her protection. She thought gratitude was her reward. But trust, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. It doesn't strike all at once. It cuts quietly through years of silence, through small dismissals that seem harmless at first until one day you realize you're bleeding from wounds you never saw being made. When Arya looked at her husband that evening, she didn't see the man who once carried her through sleepless nights when they dreamed of building an empire. She saw a stranger wearing his face, a man who had already erased her from the life they built together. And perhaps the cruelest part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the realization that the betrayal had been happening long before that night, hidden beneath polite smiles, behind the illusion of stability. That's the thing about heartbreak. It doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it's been sitting quietly in the room with you for years, waiting for the moment you finally notice. That's how love often begins, with the belief that loyalty guarantees safety. Maybe you've had your own moment like that, when someone you trusted revealed a truth you weren't ready to see. A friend who disappeared when you needed them most. A partner who promised forever but gave you silence instead. A family member who chose pride over love. If you have, then you already understand Arya's silence at that dinner table. The kind of silence that isn't weakness, it's shock. The body's way of protecting the soul when words can't carry the weight of betrayal. That night wasn't just about divorce papers or lost wealth. It was about identity. Everything Arya had believed about herself, wife, mother, partner, builder, was being stripped away, and she didn't even know who she would be once the papers were signed. But here's the truth: no one tells you when your world collapses, when everything you've built crumbles. It also clears the ground for something new to rise. It doesn't feel like that in the beginning. It feels like death, but often it's a rebirth in disguise. So if you've ever had someone break your trust so deeply that you didn't know how to breathe afterward, stay with me. Because Arya's story isn't just about loss. It's about what came after. It's about how a woman walked out of her own ruins barefoot and somehow found her wings waiting for her on the other side. To the outside world, she was perfection personified, elegant, accomplished, and admired by many. Her name appeared in magazines beside her husband's as a symbol of power and grace. People whispered that she had it all: love, family, wealth, respect. But what they didn't see was how often she stood alone inside that mansion, walking its long halls like a guest in her own home. Arya wasn't just Darian Layton's wife. She was the heart behind the empire. When the company was still just an idea sketched on the back of a notepad, she was there, building proposals, drafting letters, cooking late-night meals while Darian chased meetings across cities. She had been the quiet engine of every success they celebrated. Yet, as the empire grew, her place within it began to shrink. She noticed it in the way meetings were held without her, in the way new employees stopped addressing her as Mrs. Layton and started calling her the chairman's wife. Success has a strange way of revealing people. The same wealth that was meant to bring comfort slowly replaced connection. The more power Darian gained, the less he looked at her with warmth. His voice became cooler, his compliments rarer. And though she smiled through the photographs, Arya had begun to live on borrowed happiness, pretending the silence between them was just a phase. Her children followed the rhythm their father set. Celine, ambitious and polished, adored her father's approval more than her mother's affection. Travor admired wealth the way young men often do, as proof of strength. Arya loved them deeply, but their loyalty had already shifted without her realizing it. She ignored the warning signs because that's what love often does. It covers cracks with hope. But that birthday night ripped the veil away completely. When Darian handed her those documents, it wasn't just a marriage ending. It was the final confirmation that she had built her entire life on sand. Every dream, every sacrifice, every act of faith, all of it was being swept away by the tide of greed and indifference. Yet even as the shock anchored her to that chair, there was something in her eyes, a quiet refusal to collapse completely. The woman who had given her all didn't vanish that night. She simply went silent, gathering what little strength she had left. Arya didn't scream. She didn't plead. She didn't throw the papers back in his face. She simply stood, her chair scraping lightly against the floor, and said the words that would echo long after she was gone. "Thank you, Darian, for showing me who you've become." Then she turned and walked away from the table. Each step was heavy, but each one was also the beginning of something neither Darian nor her children could yet comprehend. In that moment, Arya Layton lost her title, her home, and her name in their world. But she kept something far greater, her dignity, and that was the seed of her transformation. Because this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when a person realizes that everything they thought defined them was never who they truly were. It's about a woman who was buried under roles, expectations, and luxury, and how being stripped of it all forced her to discover the strength that had been waiting within her all along. But what if I told you that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to her? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? How can destruction become deliverance? How can betrayal become the very door to freedom? That night, when Arya walked out of her mansion barefoot, the world would have seen a woman ruined, stripped of wealth, power, and the love of her family. But what the world didn't see was the faint spark that still glowed inside her. It's the spark that exists in all of us, the small, stubborn light that refuses to go out, even when everything else does. Arya didn't know it yet, but that spark was about to lead her somewhere new. Somewhere her name, her beauty, and her status meant nothing. But her spirit would mean everything. Pain has a way of cleansing illusions. It takes away what we thought we needed so we can finally see what truly matters. And in Arya's case, the loss of her wealth wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Preparation for the woman she was always meant to become. Every person who's ever been betrayed faces a choice: to let the wound define them, or to let it refine them. That's the question this story asks you to think about. Not just what happened to Arya, but what happens in all of us when life forces us to start over. Because sometimes starting over isn't weakness. It's strength disguised as surrender. For years, Arya had been defined by others: Darian's wife, her children's mother, the quiet partner in a billion-dollar empire. But now, with nothing left to lose, she was finally free to define herself. Free to fail, free to dream again, free to rebuild not for approval, but for peace. There's a beauty in reaching rock bottom that few understand, because from there, every direction leads upward. And so, as Arya stepped into the night with a single suitcase and a heart full of unanswered questions, she wasn't walking away from her life. She was walking toward it, toward the woman she was about to discover, toward the strength that betrayal had accidentally gifted her, toward the story that would one day make countless others believe that healing isn't just possible, it's inevitable. So, if you've ever been broken by someone you trusted, if you've ever wondered why you had to lose so much just to find yourself again, stay with this story till the end. because what Arya found on the other side of heartbreak will change the way you see pain, loyalty, and love itself. Welcome, my friend, to Mr. Williams' Storytelling, where every story is a journey through the heart. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because each week we bring you powerful tales that remind you, even when life breaks you, it's only shaping the person you're meant to become. And if you've been here before, thank you for returning. Your support keeps these stories alive, helping them reach others who might need a little light of their own. Now, back to Arya. When she left that mansion, the rain had already begun to fall harder. The city lights blurred in her eyes, not from the storm, but from the tears she refused to let escape. Behind her, marble pillars and glass walls stood like silent witnesses to the moment her old life ended. But in front of her lay something new, though she couldn't see it yet. There's a certain calm that follows devastation. The moment when you realize there's nothing left to protect, no image to maintain, no expectations to meet. It's just you, raw, exposed, and completely honest for the first time in years. That's where Arya was, standing at the edge of her old world, holding a suitcase that carried only a few pieces of clothing and her mother's bracelet. Her hands were shaking, but there was a strange steadiness in her heart. The same heart that had once believed in love and loyalty had now learned a harsher truth. Sometimes the people you build your world around are the very ones who tear it down. Yet even as she stood in the rain, Arya didn't curse the heavens or beg for answers. Instead, she whispered something under her breath, a promise, though no one was there to hear it. I'll rise again. Somehow, those 3 words would become the quiet foundation of everything that followed. Because when the world takes everything from you, you have 2 choices, to crumble with it or to rise from the dust and rebuild. Arya chose to rise. And though she didn't know it yet, her journey from that rain-soaked street would one day inspire thousands, not through wealth, not through status, but through courage, compassion, and the unshakable belief that broken things can still become beautiful. So stay close, because what comes next isn't just the story of Arya Layton. It's the story of every person who has ever been betrayed, abandoned, or forgotten, and found a way to turn that pain into power. It's about what happens after the heartbreak, after the papers are signed, after the world stops clapping for you. It's about the woman who rebuilt her life from ashes and taught us that sometimes the best gift life can give you is the chance to start over. Before we begin her journey, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to start from nothing? What did that moment teach you about strength? And if Arya's story has already touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Mr. Williams' Storytelling. Because here, every story reminds you that even in your darkest moments, there's always light waiting to be found. Now, let's step back to where it all began, before the betrayal, before the storm, before the birthday that changed everything. Arya Layton was the kind of woman people admired without even speaking to her. There was a quiet authority in the way she carried herself, a calm that made those around her feel as though she had always been in control. Her hair, the color of polished chestnut, fell gracefully over her shoulders. Her eyes were soft yet discerning, capable of reading a room without judgment. She smiled often, but never superficially. Every curve of her lips carried warmth, even when the world expected her to remain stoic. To outsiders, Arya's life seemed flawless. She had married Darian Layton, a man whose name alone commanded respect in business circles and high society. Together, they embodied influence, style, and sophistication, the couple whose presence could elevate any event, whose decisions shaped industries, and whose household was the envy of many. But Arya's world wasn't measured by appearances alone. She was the heartbeat behind the empire, the unacknowledged architect of countless victories that bore Darian's name. She had begun in the early days, drafting proposals late into the night, ensuring the company's foundation was as steady as her belief in him. Her intelligence, patience, and foresight had carried the company through early financial hurdles, legal disputes, and investor doubts. Yet despite these contributions, she rarely claimed credit. It wasn't pride that held her back. It was the conviction that success was meaningless if it could not be shared with the people she loved. At home, Arya wore a different mask. She was mother, wife, and the silent organizer of their lives. Mornings began with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toast, a ritual she maintained for decades. She would walk the hallways, ensuring each room reflected the order she cherished, straightening frames, fluffing pillows, and smoothing tablecloths. Celine, her daughter, often observed these gestures with quiet admiration. Trevor, her son, barely acknowledged the effort, too wrapped up in his own ambitions. Arya's inner voice was a constant companion. It was both her mirror and her advisor, reminding her of boundaries while pushing her to give more than the world demanded. Some mornings, she would pause by the grand window overlooking the ocean, listening to the distant waves, and reflect on her choices. She thought about the sacrifices she had made, the opportunities she had passed on for the sake of family, and the small dreams that were tucked away in the corners of her heart. There was pride in these reflections, but also a lingering melancholy, a quiet understanding that perfection came at a personal cost. Despite all, Arya never regretted her life. She believed deeply in love, loyalty, and the power of shared ambition. She believed that her patience, kindness, and unwavering support for her family would create a home where bonds were unshakable. But beneath the surface, a subtle unease had begun to take root, a whisper that her world might not be as stable as she had always assumed. And so, every smile she offered, every gesture of care, and every act of grace carried with it the weight of a woman who loved too much, worked too hard, and sometimes feared too little. On the surface, the Leighton family seemed untouchable. Invitations to galas, high-profile fundraisers, and social gatherings arrived weekly, each event a testament to their influence. Cameras flashed when Arya entered a room. Whispers of admiration followed her everywhere she went. To strangers, her life was enviable, a portrait of success, elegance, and effortless composure. But inside the walls of the mansion, the story was very different. The grandeur of the estate could not conceal the quiet gaps between people. The laughter at public events was rehearsed, smiles carefully timed, and polite conversations rarely touched the heart. Arya moved through this world with grace, masking the subtle loneliness that had begun to settle like dust in unused corners. Darian, though charismatic and commanding in public, had grown distant at home. His compliments, once genuine, now came sparingly, measured like a token rather than an expression of affection. Celine's eyes followed him more than her mother, and Trevor mirrored his father's moods, adopting a reserved detachment that left Arya feeling invisible. Even daily routines, breakfast, morning briefings, shared drives to meetings, were marked by silence. Conversations were transactional rather than intimate. Arya would often prepare her family's favorite dishes, arranging the table carefully, only to find herself alone with her thoughts when Darian was called away and the children retreated to their devices. She carried her emptiness quietly, filling the gaps with work, charity projects, and fleeting distractions. But at night, in the quiet of her bedroom, the contrast between appearances and reality became impossible to ignore. The soft hum of the lights, the polished floors, the carefully curated art, all of it highlighted the absence of genuine warmth. Arya knew the world believed she was living a dream. They saw celebrations, vacations, and accolades. They did not see the sighs in the hallway, the quiet moments spent staring out the window at a horizon that no longer promised joy, or the conversations with herself that explored a growing sense of isolation. She began to question herself. Was she failing as a wife? Had she given too much or not enough? Could love be measured by wealth, titles, and appearances? Every answer seemed inadequate, Yet she pressed on, maintaining the image that others expected. The irony was sharp. The more perfect her life appeared to outsiders, the emptier it felt from within. And while Arya maintained the illusion of balance, she could not ignore the small, persistent ache that whispered every night. The life she showed to the world was only half of the story. The Leighton mansion was a cathedral of elegance, its architecture a blend of modern sophistication and timeless design. Marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers overhead. Each hallway was lined with family portraits, though the eyes in the painting seemed to observe Arya more than her own family ever did. She often paused in these halls, running her fingers lightly along the polished surfaces, feeling both the comfort and the emptiness they represented. Dinner time, once a sacred family ritual, had become a muted affair. The dining room, expansive and immaculate, felt like a stage. Fine china gleamed under the candlelight, silverware arranged with precision, and a centerpiece of fresh flowers filled the room with faint fragrance. Yet no warmth lingered in the air. Arya's husband sat at the head of the table, upright and composed, eyes occasionally darting to his phone instead of engaging in conversation. The children mirrored his posture, their bodies rigid, their expressions rehearsed. Words were scarce. The clinking of cutlery against plates was louder than any dialogue, a mechanical rhythm that underscored the silence. Even when Arya tried to break it, her voice soft but inviting, the effect was fleeting. "Pass the bread, please," she would say, or, "This dish turned out just right, didn't it?" Only nods and polite murmurs answered her. She caught herself watching their eyes, distant, absent, almost avoiding contact, and felt a sharp pang of loneliness. The mansion itself seemed to respond to the distance. Echoes of her steps in the long hallways felt hollow. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls and floors, and the faint creaks of the marble whispered reminders of the quiet that had crept into the family. The home, once alive with laughter and warmth, now mirrored the tension between the people living within it. Arya often lingered at the windows, overlooking the expansive gardens and the distant shimmer of the ocean. The world outside was alive, teeming with motion and possibility, while inside her own life felt paused, framed in perfection but devoid of substance. The soft flicker of candlelight against the polished surfaces reminded her daily that appearances could be flawless, even when connection was missing. Each glance across the table, each subdued smile, each carefully measured word reinforced the truth. Perfection could exist without fulfillment, beauty without affection, and wealth without love. Arya understood this quietly, the realization settling like a shadow over her daily life. Yet she remained, silent, composed, enduring. It started with small changes, imperceptible at first, but unmistakable to Arya. Darian's touch, once warm and reassuring, had grown brief, almost automatic. A hand on her shoulder during a meeting of friends, a fleeting brush of fingers at a gala. Gestures that were once comforting now felt obligatory, like a man fulfilling expectations rather than expressing affection. The children mirrored this shift. Celine, once attentive to her mother's counsel, now checked her phone during conversations, offering polite nods but little engagement. Traver, who used to linger after school or weekend activities to share his thoughts, began retreating to his room or spending long hours studying with minimal explanation. Their attention had moved elsewhere, and Arya, while sensing the distance, refused to fully acknowledge it. Love had a way of making you overlook warning signs. Then there were the subtle signs that gnawed at her consciousness. Phone calls Darian took in the quiet of his office abruptly ended when she approached. Late-night meetings that became increasingly frequent, accompanied by a vague sense of secrecy in his tone. Invitations to social events where he had to leave early became a weekly occurrence. Arya tried to remind herself that these were normal in business life, that she was perhaps being overly sensitive. yet a quiet knot of doubt had begun to grow in her chest. At home, small gestures carried unexpected weight. A hand brushing past hers without meeting her eyes, an unfinished sentence, a sigh at the wrong moment. Each one a piece of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. She tried to fill the gaps with kindness, conversation, and efforts to connect, but often met only polite acknowledgement. The absence of intimacy became louder than any words, creating an invisible barrier that separated her from the people she had trusted most. Even the children began to demonstrate small signs of detachment. Celine's laughter sometimes held a sharp edge, mirroring her father's distant charm. Trevor's attentiveness waned during family discussions, replaced with subtle defiance or silence. Arya caught herself observing these changes with quiet worry, her maternal instinct alert to shifts she couldn't fully control. She told herself it was adolescence giving way to adulthood, not realizing that the threads of loyalty she assumed were woven securely were slowly loosening. Every evening, as the mansion grew quiet, she replayed moments in her mind, the subtle avoidance, the cold tone, the unanswered questions. The awareness settled like a shadow in her chest. Arya understood, in a quiet, aching way, that something was changing in the people she had loved and nurtured the most. And while she could not yet name it, the sense of inevitability began to form. The life she thought she knew may not survive the next turn. Despite the distance and quiet tension that filled her days, Arya carried herself with a warmth that never faltered. She spoke softly to the staff, remembered birthdays, and tended to small acts of kindness that often went unnoticed. The way she arranged flowers in the living room, prepared tea for an elderly neighbor, or left notes of encouragement for her children spoke to a heart that believed in connection, even when it wasn't reciprocated. Yet beneath this warmth, there was a quiet melancholy, a persistent awareness that her life was more fragile than it appeared. Arya often lingered in empty rooms, listening to the subtle echoes of her own footsteps, thinking about the moments that had passed too quickly. She remembered evenings filled with laughter that seemed unbreakable at the time, now replaced with polite nods and distant glances. Her heart carried gentle sadness for the ways in which love had shifted, the realization that devotion could be overlooked, that care could be taken for granted. She didn't allow herself to wallow. Instead, she transformed her feelings into subtle acts of grace. Every smile she offered, every word of encouragement, every gesture of patience was a quiet defiance against the creeping emptiness. Arya also reflected on the impermanence of appearances. The mansion, the luxury, the polished social image. They had their charm, but they were fragile shells. True warmth, she realized, could not be manufactured. It could only exist in moments of honesty, in shared laughter, in the gentle weight of someone truly present. And yet, for her, those moments were increasingly rare. Still, she persisted. In her journal, she wrote about hopes and dreams that no one would read, small meditations about the life she wished to cultivate within herself, even if the world seemed indifferent. These reflections were private, tender, and tinged with a quiet sadness, but they kept her grounded. They reminded her that even in a life seemingly perfect, one could still feel deeply, think clearly, and hope quietly. The narrative of her life carried this delicate tension, the warmth of her heart clashing with the isolation around her. It was a life lived gracefully, but one that bore invisible fractures. And though she did not yet know the extent of the challenges ahead, the melancholy that accompanied her daily routines was a subtle signal, a reminder that the world she believed secure was capable of shifting entirely in a single evening. In these moments, Arya became both observer and participant in her own life, a woman aware of her beauty, her strength, and her vulnerability. She was fully present in the roles she inhabited, yet her inner voice whispered that the life she knew could not last forever. Arya's life, from the outside, was one of flawless charm and enviable elegance. Her laughter, her composure, and the radiant way she carried herself suggested security and contentment. But beneath the polished veneer of high ceilings, marble floors, and chandelier light, there were fractures that no one could see. Those cracks were quiet. They whispered in the pauses of conversation, flickered in glances that lingered too briefly, and made themselves known in moments of stillness when the mansion's grandeur seemed almost oppressive. They were the silent companions of nights when Darian's hand rested on hers without warmth, or when her children's eyes avoided hers as though afraid of what they might reflect back. As she walked through the hallways that had once felt like home, Arya felt a duality that no photograph could capture. Every room held memories of laughter, achievements, and small joys, yet every step carried the echo of absence, a subtle loneliness that grew heavier with each passing day. It was a life rich in appearances but poor in intimacy. Sometimes she would pause, looking out of the grand windows at the gardens below, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond, and she would think perhaps, all this beauty, the marble, the gold accents, the perfectly arranged flowers, could never fill the quiet spaces inside a heart yearning for connection. Perhaps the more perfect the world looks, the more hollow it can feel when love is absent. It was in these moments of reflection that Arya began to understand a truth she had resisted for years. Appearances could deceive. Comfort could be mistaken for security. Smiles could hide exhaustion, pain, and even betrayal. And sometimes the people you trust most are capable of tearing down the world you have carefully built. This realization didn't crush her, not yet, but it prepared her, unknowingly, for the evening that would change everything. The evening when the cracks she had long sensed would widen into a chasm. As Arya moved silently through the mansion, she carried herself with grace, but her heart whispered a quiet warning. Even the strongest facades can falter when the people we love no longer share our loyalty. And so, with every perfectly placed object, every elegant smile, and every moment of poised composure, a story was unfolding quietly beneath the surface, a story that no visitor, no socialite, and no photograph would ever capture. Sometimes the prettiest smiles hide the deepest cracks, and Arya's smile, though serene to the world, carried the weight of a secret she could no longer ignore. The morning began with a quiet stillness. Sunlight filtered through the soft linen curtains, spilling across the room in gentle gold. Arya woke slowly, stretching beneath the warmth of her sheets, savoring the rare luxury of a morning untouched by work or meetings. It was her birthday, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to feel the simple joy of being celebrated. Not for accomplishments, not for appearances, but for herself. Her mother's old bracelet gleamed in the morning light, a talisman of love and remembrance. Arya clasped it gently around her wrist, remembering the women who had shaped her life with kindness, resilience, and quiet courage. For a fleeting moment, she felt the weight of years fall away, leaving only the hope that today might be different. Lighter, warmer, filled with laughter. Her assistant's soft knock at the door reminded her of the evening ahead. "A dinner tonight at the mansion, Mrs. Layton," she said with a hint of excitement. "Darian has planned a small celebration." Arya smiled, a warmth creeping into her chest that had been absent for far too long. "He remembered," she whispered, almost to herself. The words carried a fragile hope that had been fading over years of distance and quiet separations. She let herself linger on the thought, imagining the table set with care, the soft flicker of candlelight reflecting off polished silverware, and the gentle presence of her family gathered in shared celebration. The day unfolded with meticulous attention. Arya spent the morning preparing her favorite lemon cake, a recipe handed down from her mother. The act of baking grounded her, connecting her to simpler joys that had become rare in a life dominated by responsibilities and expectations. She measured, stirred, and folded with care, infusing each step with love and anticipation. The aroma of citrus and sugar filled the kitchen, a promise of sweetness to come. Outside, the garden was alive with early spring blooms. Soft winds carried the scent of fresh earth and budding flowers into the open windows, mingling with the warm fragrance of the cake. Birds called from the trees, their melodies punctuating the quiet rhythm of the day. Arya paused by the window frequently, allowing herself to savor the scene, imagining the evening ahead as a moment of reconnection, a pause in the rhythm of life where family, laughter, and gratitude might fill the space between them. Even as she moved through her preparations, a faint tension lingered in the edges of her awareness. Years of subtle distance and unspoken words had conditioned her to notice the nuances, a hesitant smile, a glance that lingered too long on a phone screen, the quiet steps of her children retreating to other rooms. Yet today, she chose to set those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the anticipation of a celebration that could restore a sense of closeness, even for a few hours. She imagined the evening, a table adorned with fine china, silverware catching the candlelight, soft music floating through the halls, and her family gathered with warmth in their eyes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps tonight would be a moment where the distance would shrink, where smiles would be genuine and hearts would align again. As the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, Arya finished her preparations, placing the lemon cake carefully on a polished serving tray. She took a deep breath, smoothing the folds of her dress, and allowed herself to feel the excitement of a celebration that, in her mind, was not just about a birthday, but about reclaiming the intimacy and warmth she had quietly longed for. The mansion itself seemed to hum with expectation. Candles were lit in the dining room. Soft music was cued to play in the background, and every detail was arranged to reflect care, elegance, and love. Arya could almost hear the voices she hoped would fill the space: laughter, shared memories, gentle teasing, and the kind of heartfelt conversation that reminded one of the depth of family ties. She paused at the center of the room, hands folded, taking in the moment. This was the calm before the evening, the stillness that carried both joy and promise. In that pause, her heart swelled with cautious optimism, clinging to the belief that today might finally be a day where hope would bloom alongside celebration. Little did she know, this carefully nurtured anticipation was on the verge of colliding with a reality she could never have imagined, a moment that would test the very foundation of trust, love, and belonging she had built her life upon. Evening settled softly over the mansion, painting the sky in shades of apricot and rose. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into a scene of quiet intimacy. Candles flickered on the polished mahogany table, their flames dancing gently in rhythm with the subtle notes of a piano playing somewhere in the background. The music was soft, familiar, and comforting, filling the room without ever demanding attention, a delicate accompaniment to what Arya had imagined would be a perfect evening. The aroma of freshly baked lemon cake wafted through the air, mingling with the subtle fragrance of flowers arranged in carefully chosen vases. The cake's zesty sweetness seemed to mirror the fragile hope in Arya's chest, a tangible reminder that small pleasures, when nurtured with care, could bring light even in the midst of uncertainty. She had iced it meticulously, smoothing each curve with patient hands, adding delicate lemon zest curls that caught the candlelight like tiny golden threads. The table setting was immaculate: polished silverware, fine china with subtle gilded edges, and crystal glasses that reflected the flickering candlelight in soft prisms. Arya had placed small, thoughtful touches: a folded napkin at each setting, a sprig of fresh mint beside each plate, gestures of love she hoped would communicate more than words ever could. Arya moved around the room, adjusting the chairs, smoothing the tablecloth, and inhaling the rich mix of scents, that told her the evening was ready. Her heart, usually steady and composed, thumped with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. For weeks she had envisioned this moment, a night of closeness, of shared laughter, of warmth that could bridge the gaps that had quietly grown between her and her family. She paused for a moment, standing in the soft glow of the candles. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had endured much, yet still carried hope in her eyes. For a fleeting instant, she allowed herself to imagine the sound of Darian's laughter echoing softly across the room, Celine teasing her gently as she sampled the cake, and Travers sharing a story from his day. It was a scene of simple joy, a fleeting perfection she had longed for, and it wrapped around her heart like a fragile embrace. Outside, the gardens were bathed in the soft silver of twilight, the wind carrying the scent of blooming flowers through the slightly open windows. The gentle rustling of leaves blended with the music inside, creating a harmony that made the mansion feel alive, vibrant, and welcoming. Arya breathed deeply, letting the world fill her senses, anchoring herself in the beauty and possibility of the moment. Even the smallest details contributed to the promise of a perfect evening. The soft hum of a ceiling fan stirred the candle flames slightly, causing them to flicker and cast delicate shadows across the room. The chairs, carefully positioned around the table, invited presence, conversation, and connection. The lemon cake, sitting at the center like a beacon, seemed to symbolize more than dessert, a hope, a sweetness, a chance for hearts to meet again. In that delicate balance of light, scent, and sound, Arya allowed herself to feel something she had rarely permitted: unguarded hope. She imagined the dinner unfolding as she had envisioned it, a celebration of life, love, and the quiet bonds that had sustained her. She could almost hear the laughter, the gentle teasing, the shared glances that spoke more than words ever could, and as she moved to light the last candle, her heart carried a simple, almost childlike anticipation. Tonight, she believed, might be a turning point. Tonight, the distance that had quietly grown between her and her family could be bridged. Tonight, the warmth of connection might finally fill the silence that had settled over her life. But even as she arranged the final details, the faintest tremor of unease lingered, a subtle awareness that perfection, no matter how carefully cultivated, could be fragile. Yet she pushed. The thought aside, choosing instead to savor the moment, to breathe in the music, the candlelight, and the citrus sweetness of her creation. For Arya, this night was more than a birthday. It was a chance, however brief, to reclaim connection, to remind herself that love, hope, and family could still exist amidst the quiet shadows of distance. And she carried that fragile, glowing hope with every careful step she took toward what she believed would be a perfect evening. The evening unfolded quietly, almost ceremoniously. Candles flickered, their soft glow casting gentle light across the polished surfaces. Music drifted through the room, delicate and unobtrusive. Arya took her seat at the table, her hands resting lightly in her lap, anticipation dancing through her chest. Darian was already there, composed as always, his expression carefully neutral. Celine and Travers sat beside him, their postures impeccable, but their eyes betraying a quiet detachment that made Arya's heart flutter with unease she struggled to name. She smiled softly, trying to break the tension. "You're all being too serious for a birthday dinner," she teased lightly, her voice warm, carrying hope she barely dared to acknowledge. She had imagined laughter, shared stories, and casual conversation, but a subtle stillness filled the air instead. Then, Darian reached across the table, placing a crisp white envelope before her. The paper was pristine, unmarked except for her name written neatly across the front. "Happy birthday, Arya," he said, his tone calm, deliberate, measured in a way that made her pulse quicken with uncertainty. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. Something about its weight, its starkness, felt wrong. She tore it open carefully, her heart skipping a beat as she unfolded the first document. Divorce papers. Her breath caught in her throat. The words on the page were precise, cold, and final. Lines detailing the dissolution of her marriage stared back at her, each one heavier than the last. And then she noticed the additional document, a transfer agreement. Her name, her claims to Leighton Global, the mansion, and all associated wealth were reassigned to Darian. Every asset, every possession she had considered part of her life's work, now belonged entirely to him. She looked up, searching for some flicker of explanation in her husband's eyes, some indication that this was a mistake, a cruel jest. There was none. Darian's calm gaze met hers, unyielding, measured, and devoid of warmth. Then, the ultimate betrayal revealed itself. Celine and Traver had signed as witnesses. Her own children, the ones she had nurtured, guided, and loved unconditionally, had lent their names to formalize her removal from everything she had helped build. Why? Her voice trembled, barely audible over the soft music and the flickering candlelight. The question was almost absurd in its simplicity. How could the people she trusted most execute such a calculated severance of their bond with her? Darian's sigh was slow, deliberate, and unfeeling. You've had a good life, Arya, but things have changed. The board believes new leadership is needed. You'll have what's fair, a trust fund, enough to live comfortably. Her mind spun. The world she had assumed was steady, the life she had cherished, had collapsed in a single motion. The betrayal was total. Her husband of decades, the partner with whom she had built an empire, had orchestrated her removal. And her children, had not merely observed, they had participated. Arya's eyes filled with disbelief. She could not process the reality, the magnitude of what had occurred. Every memory of their family dinners, celebrations, quiet conversations, and shared dreams now felt like illusions, carefully constructed to mask a hidden agenda. She had lived in a world that, to her, had seemed whole, only to discover that the foundation had been corroding beneath her feet. The rooms seemed to shrink around her. The soft candlelight suddenly felt harsh, the music intrusive rather than comforting. Each carefully prepared detail of the evening, the flowers, the lemon cake, the polished table, now mocked her sense of security, highlighting the depth of the deception. Celine's eyes were fixed on the table, emotionless. Traver's posture remained rigid, as though by remaining composed he could justify the indefensible. Darian's calm rationality pressed down on her like an unyielding weight, each word and gesture designed to reinforce her isolation. Arya felt a sharp pang of betrayal, a visceral gut punch that left her trembling. Her hands shook as she gathered the documents, the paper cutting lightly into her fingers. The room spun. Her mind struggled to reconcile the image of her family she had always cherished with the stark reality sitting before her. For the first time in decades, Arya felt completely unmoored. Every certainty, every trust she had held, every quiet hope she had nurtured was gone. In its place rose a profound emptiness, a void that pressed against her chest and made breathing feel heavy. The betrayal was not only legal but intimate. It was a fracture of every bond she had ever relied upon. Her world, the one she had painstakingly cultivated with love, patience, and sacrifice, had been swept away in a single deliberate act. And in that silence, broken only by the faint flicker of candle flames, Arya realized the unbearable truth. The people she loved most had become strangers, and the life she had believed in was no longer hers. Arya sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the documents. The soft glow of the candles reflected off the polished surfaces, casting shadows that now seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. The lemon cake, meticulously prepared, sat untouched on the table, its sweet fragrance doing nothing to ease the storm raging inside her. Her mind raced, attempting to reconcile the scene before her with the life she had known. Could this truly be happening? Had she misread the distance in her husband's gaze, the detachment of her children, the subtle signals she had ignored over the years? Or had she been blind, lulled by hope into believing that the bonds of family and love could withstand the quiet erosion of trust? Confusion gripped her tightly. Every memory, the years of support she had given Darian, the nights spent working side by side to build Leighton Global, the sacrifices she had quietly made, now felt like pieces of a puzzle thrown into disarray. She questioned herself. Had she done something wrong? Had she failed as a mother, as a wife, as a partner in the empire they had created together? Her own mind became a labyrinth of doubt, twisting and turning with each passing heartbeat. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she struggled to release them. Her shock was so complete, so intense, that it seemed impossible to process. The words of the documents, the signatures of her children, and Darian's cold, measured tone combined into a weight she could scarcely bear. She felt unmoored, as if the very ground beneath her had been pulled away, leaving her suspended in a void of disbelief and grief. Arya's gaze shifted to her children. Celine's eyes were averted, fixed on some invisible point across the table. Travers sat rigid, his face carefully controlled, as though emotion could be suppressed and replaced with composure. Her heart ached in a way that was deeper than mere sadness. It was a pain rooted in betrayal, in the collapse of the trust she had believed unbreakable. The children she had nurtured, taught, and loved unconditionally had now become agents of her deepest heartbreak. Her body felt heavy, as though the air itself pressed down upon her. The world around her, the flickering candles, the gentle music, the pristine table setting, seemed absurdly normal against the magnitude of what had just occurred. It was as if life itself had continued in polite rhythm while her reality shattered completely. Questions tore through her mind. Why now? Why like this? Could a life built on love and devotion truly unravel in a single evening? Each question had no answer, leaving only the raw ache of betrayal. Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope, the papers that had once been ordinary now transformed into instruments of pain. The heartbreak was suffocating, but also oddly isolating. No one could truly inhabit the same space of disbelief she now occupied. Even as Darian spoke, offering rationalizations that would have seemed cold and calculated in any other context, she could barely comprehend the words. They were sounds filtering through a haze of shock and sorrow, each one amplifying the sense of loss. Her heart was heavy, yet strangely alert, aware of every detail, every nuance of expression and silence. The betrayal, so complete and deliberate, demanded attention. She felt her pulse quicken, her chest tighten, and her stomach churn. This was not a gentle heartbreak. It was a seismic upheaval, a sudden tearing away of everything she had known, trusted, and loved. For the first time in decades, Arya allowed herself to feel fully. Every emotion, confusion, disbelief, sorrow, and even faint flickers of anger washed over her in waves. There was no escape, no distraction, no polite deflection. Darian's voice cut through the thick, trembling silence, calm, measured, devoid of emotion. "Arya, this is not personal," he said, as though the words could somehow soften the blow. "It's business. The board believes new leadership is necessary for the company to thrive. You'll receive a trust fund sufficient for your lifestyle. Consider it fair." His tone was clinical, deliberate, like someone explaining a financial transaction, rather than addressing a partner of decades. Every syllable carried authority, but no warmth, no acknowledgement of the devastation laid bare before him. It was a voice designed to rationalize the irreparable, to make the unimaginable seem logical. Arya's mind struggled to interpret the words. She heard them, understood them, but they barely registered. Her world had been unmade, and the cold logic only amplified the shock. Business, fairness, leadership, These were abstract concepts, irrelevant to the raw human betrayal she was experiencing. Her husband had reduced the life they had built together into numbers, transactions, and signatures. And then there were the children, Celine and Traver, her own flesh and blood, witnesses to the legal destruction of their mother's life, yet sitting with composure that mocked her devastation. Traver's eyes, usually filled with curiosity and mischief, avoided hers completely. There was a tightness in his jaw, a rigidity in his shoulders, as if the act of signing had already hardened him against emotion. Celine's gaze flickered toward Darian intermittently, as though seeking silent approval for her role in this betrayal. The sight struck Arya like a physical blow, an emotional gut punch that left her reeling. She opened her mouth, but no words emerged. How could her children, who had once clung to her hand, laughed with her, shared secrets in whispers late at night, now become instruments of her loss? She searched for any sign of hesitation, regret, or compassion, but found only polite compliance. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to understand, to reach through their composure, but the truth was undeniable. They had chosen allegiance to Darian's vision over the woman who had given them everything. Darian continued, his voice unwavering. Change is inevitable, Arya. You must accept it. The company needs stability, the family needs clarity, and this is the way forward. Arya's mind recoiled. Stability, clarity. What sense did those words make when trust had been destroyed, when the people she loved most had abandoned her in the span of a single evening? The rationalizations intended to comfort only deepened the rupture, emphasizing the gap between her experience and the detached world her husband inhabited. She glanced at her children again, trying to detect a flicker of remorse. Celine's fingers rested lightly on the table, motionless. Traver's eyes, downcast and controlled, avoided contact. It was as if they had internalized the logic Darian spoke, as if fairness, stability, and business considerations could erase the heartbreak they had collectively inflicted. The silence that followed Darian's words was deafening. Arya felt the weight of their gaze, absent and cold, pressing down on her chest. She could sense the careful calculation behind their actions, the deliberate distancing that had been quietly nurtured over months, perhaps years. It was a betrayal that transcended the legal documents. It was intimate, personal, and unyielding. Every heartbeat echoed in the room like a drum, each pulse reminding her that the people she had trusted most, her family, the very foundation of her life, had become strangers. The emotional shock was compounded by the stark contrast between her love and their detachment, between her devotion and their compliance. Arya's throat tightened. She could barely draw a breath. The room, filled with soft music, candlelight, and carefully arranged elegance, now felt alien, even hostile. Every detail she had prepared for a night of closeness and warmth now underscored the betrayal. The candles flickered, the shadows stretched, and the music became a cruel accompaniment to a family she no longer recognized. The realization settled deep in her chest. Darian's rationalizations could not comfort her. Celine and Traver's complicity could not be undone. She was alone in a life she had once thought shared, facing the void left by those who had promised loyalty, love, and connection. The emotional gut punch was complete, and Arya understood, fully, painfully, that the bonds she had assumed were unbreakable had been shattered by the very people she had trusted to protect and nurture them. The room seemed to contract around her. The flickering candlelight, once comforting, now exaggerated every shadow, every contour of the polished table. Arya's heart raced, each beat louder than the last, matching the quickening rhythm of her thoughts. The betrayal pressed against her chest like a weight she could neither lift nor avoid. Her pulse quickened with disbelief, each thump echoing in her ears. She wanted to scream, to demand explanation, to plead for some shred of humanity from the people she loved most. But the words lodged in her throat, tangled in a mixture of horror, confusion, and grief. Her hands trembled as she folded the documents and held them close, a fragile barrier against the truth she could not yet face fully. Celine and Travers sat silently, their composure unshaken, as though every movement and gesture of Aria's was anticipated, catalogued, and dismissed. Darian's rationalizations hung in the air like iron bars, precise, calculated, leaving no room for rebuttal. The tension in the room was nearly unbearable, a living, breathing entity that pressed against every nerve. Aria's mind raced, reconstructing memories in search of a sign she had missed. Every gentle word she had offered, every sacrifice she had made, every moment of patience and love now seemed swallowed by the void that had opened beneath her. The rising tide of tension became unbearable. She felt the room tilt, the walls close in, the floor threatening to give way. Then, as abruptly as the tension had built, silence fell. The soft music continued to play, the candles flickered faintly, but the emotional storm paused, suspended. In that quiet, the magnitude of the betrayal settled fully upon her. The silence was suffocating. No words, no movement, no reassurance. Only the realization of loss in its purest form. Her chest heaved. Tears blurred her vision. Aria's knees weakened, and she lowered herself into her chair, gripping its arms as though physical support could anchor her in the swirling tide of heartbreak. The collapse was not loud, it was intimate, private, internal. Her body shook with the weight of grief, the emotional release she had long resisted finally breaking through. Her mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Years of trust, devotion, and shared dreams had been reduced to a moment, a signature, a calculated act of severance. The perfection of her life, the love she had believed in, the family she had nurtured, all gone in an instant. Every sound became exaggerated, the soft tick of a clock, the distant hum of city life beyond the mansion's walls, even the faint rustle of a napkin as if mocking her. Aria pressed her face into her hands, her body curling slightly as the room closed in. The lemon cake, the candles, the music, all symbols of a hoped-for warmth, now served as a stark contrast to the void that enveloped her. Yet beneath the collapse there remained a faint, trembling awareness. Even in despair, her mind catalogued every detail, every expression, every subtle betrayal. Though physically weakened, emotionally shredded, Aria's consciousness remained alive, absorbing the enormity of the moment. She understood, in that quiet collapse, that her life had shifted irreversibly. The tension had risen, the silence had pressed down, and now, in the raw aftermath, she faced the impossible task of accepting reality. The emotional rhythm of the evening, anticipation, hope, betrayal, tension, silence, collapse, had left her exposed, vulnerable, and irrevocably changed. In that moment, alone amidst the polished elegance of the mansion, Aria realized the fragility of trust, the weight of betrayal, and the depth of heartbreak that could come from the very people one holds closest. And yet, beneath the raw ache, a faint spark of awareness stirred, a recognition that the night's events, as devastating as they were, marked the beginning of an uncharted path. The room, once filled with anticipation and the soft glow of candlelight, now stood in quiet aftermath. The laughter that had never arrived seemed suspended in the air, replaced by the weight of betrayal and loss. Aria sat alone at the table, the envelope and documents resting before her like tangible reminders of a life ripped away in a single evening.